In this video, I'm going to be wrapping up this workbench. And if you stick around till the end, I will go through all of the features of this one-of-a-kind vise setup I have down here. At this point, there isn't much left to do for this build. I need to make the gap stop and install the vise, and the gap stop is up first. I'm making that out of a couple pieces of 4/4 stock, and I'm getting everything milled down here. I'm cutting my pieces just a little oversized at this point, since I know that I will be doing a little bit of cleanup on them after I glue this up. I'm installing 5 dividers in the gap stop, and I'll cut them all down with the crosscut sled. The glue up for this is pretty straightforward. I just squeezed and brushed on some glue and clamped it up. The only thing to watch out for is that the dividers don't slip around while you're adding the clamps. After the glue cured, I ran the whole thing through the table saw on each side just to clean up any uneven edges. I did the same thing for the ends at the miter saw as well. This part was a little awkward because of how long the gap stop is, so I just took my time and went slow just to make sure I had good control of the piece the entire time. It's only 2 cuts, one in the front and one in the back, so it really wasn't that hard to manage. The final piece of this build is the vise. Now, Andy Klein has an installation video on his channel for these, so I'm not going to talk too much about how to install the vise itself. I am going to show what I'm doing differently, and that starts with making 2 cutouts on the top of the outer halves of the vise jaw. I used a Forstner bit to make nice rounded corners for those 2 cutouts, but before I could complete the cut, I followed Andy's directions for laying out and making the cutout for the vise itself. I am making these plans available on my Patreon and on my website. There are links for both in the description if you're interested. There's a back half to the vise jaw, and that had to be drilled to accept the 2 mag switches I'm installing. These holes had to be 3/4 of an inch deep in order to seat them, and should not be any deeper than that. After those were drilled, the 2 halves could be glued up. Almost everything from this point on was just following Andy's instructions. Several holes had to be drilled, some others tapped, and then some cork rubber glued onto the jaws. The back plate has to be cleaned up and sealed with some water-based poly in order to prevent rusting. I also pre-drilled and ran the screws in for the mag switches and rounded over some remaining corners. All right, so I've been talking about this thing since the first video on this build, I think, maybe the second one. So I am thrilled that it's finally together, and I am happy to report that my experiment paid off. I was worried that, of course, when something's just a concept in a drawing that, it might not move the way I want it to, or slide the way I want, or hold work the way I want, but that is not the case. It works perfectly. I am beyond ecstatic with how this came out. Like I feel giddy almost. Like I feel like a kid with a new toy. This is great. I love this thing. So let me show you what it can do. So first of all, the details. This is a 14-inch twin turbo vise. Andy Klein sells these, and I'll leave links to his website and to his videos where he talks about these. So I use the 14-inch, which is a smaller one, because it gives me some extra room on the outside. I chose the twin turbo vise specifically because it's designed to not rack left to right. So first thing, this thing just looks cool as hell. I mean, look at that. I mean, look at those gears. That by itself is worth having this thing. The real power of it is this 2-speed gear design. So there's a transmission in here essentially. You've got 2 speeds. One is kind of a normal speed you'd expect to see with a vise. So if I turn this, and you can see it is pretty effortless. I'm spinning this thing with one finger and it moves out at a reasonable pace. If I push this into high speed, it is much, much faster. So some of the things I wanted when I started to build this, I wanted a full length end vise on this. I wanted to be able to use the left to right to its full capabilities. So for instance, if I want to clamp a piece all the way across, I can do that without it racking and have this thing firmly held in place, and I can work along the whole length of this. That's one of the issues I had with my old vise. It wasn't the full width of the workbench. This one is. I've got that full capability. I can put pretty large pieces in here. This being the 14-inch, that means there's 14 inches between the 2 screws that are in here. And that's plenty of room. That's a lot of room. Also, with one of these vices, I can clamp over here on the side and not worry about this thing twisting, not worry about it being loose. This is just as firm as it can be. Just this by itself as a vise is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now, of course, you see the thing that's kind of standing out here is I've got these 2 mag switches up here. And those mag switches really are just a convenience factor, but they're all about the tail vices that I have in this bench. So let's take a look at those. Now, the real thing that makes this unique is what I'm about to show you now. So I mentioned my 2 tail vices. I have one on the left and one on the right. Primarily, I'm going to be using this one on this side, just like you would any normal tail vise. So for instance, if I wanted to clamp a piece of wood down and plane it. I can do that here. So as I mentioned, there's a couple pins in the bottom that will hold it in place. And I'll pull them both out for now. And I'll just show you. Let's move to slow speed right now. So without those mag switches on, this acts like any normal vise. But as soon as I flip that on, it's gonna pull this out with it. This is just a convenience factor. I could absolutely just have done this manually, but I like the convenience and the cool factor, to be frank. So if I engage that magnet, say I want to clamp this in, all right, I've got a couple of different positions that I can clamp it into. For this size, it looks like this dog hole is going to be the right one, but I'm going to have to move. It doesn't quite fit on this one. That's okay. I've got an option right here. So if I want to come and plane this, I can do that. So already I'm one better than I would have been with either setup, because you can get a tail vise that has this setup. This is your typical wagon vise, right? And you can do this and you can get this benefit. Or you can do an end vise and get all the normal benefits that you have of being able to clamp down here. Now, of course, like any wagon vise, I also have an opening here and I can clamp in that opening. And I can put a ton of pressure on there and this doesn't rack. As I'm doing this, I feel like a bit of a TV salesman. But wait, there's more. For 3 easy installments of $29.99. So here's another scenario where the work holding on this can be a little unique. Say I want to work on this piece and I want to work on the end here. Maybe I'm cutting it by hand. I don't know. There could be several reasons why I want to do something like that. I can clamp it in, and I could clamp basically any wagon vise. I could clamp it in like this, but you can see, even with some pressure on it, that's as stable as it gets. But if I clamp this in with both sides, that's not going anywhere. This is one of the spare legs from my dining chair build that I did. And one of the things I had to do when I built this was hand scrape these. I did it all with a card scraper. And I had to do it in a very similar setup to what I have right now. But I was doing it with my old vise, with a dog in that vise, and I had a lot of problems, first of all, with it popping out. That happened a lot, but that really isn't the big thing I'm showing here. So I had to have it essentially like this to scrape it, right? Essentially that activity. And I had to do all of the sides. So I would go through and do those. But I ran into a problem when I had to do this side of this leg, because in order to do this side, I can't use it in this situation. So the way to do this side is with a more traditional end vise like this. And I was running into a problem doing that where, because of the odd shape of this, that vise would rack a bunch. With this vise and it's non-racking, this holds this just solid as a rock. So I've got my wagon vise to use just like I was on that, and I have more support. I had more support under the end of it when I was actually scraping it. Plus, I still do have this. And a dull card scraper, apparently. There we go. So, one vise setup, and I can do all of those operations.